Chapter 10. Tall Man Standing. In North America, the 1870s and 1880s were good years for God, at least by secular standards. With the flow of virtually unimpeded immigration from Europe and the British Isles that followed upon the end of the U.S. Civil War, and in the North on the achievement of Canadian Confederation, almost every denomination grew markedly in numbers. Theological aggrandizement marked the era. The most significant démarche on the Catholic side was the promulgation in 1870 of the dogma of infallibility for ex cathedra papal declarations. Whatever the doubts of some Catholic theologians, particularly German and French, in North America it was well received at the popular level. It became something of a badge of ethnic pride among Catholic immigrant groups, minorities in the larger Protestant population. On the Protestant side of the ledger, the most vivid doctrinal developments involved evangelicals, not simply those within explicitly radical evangelical groups, but tranches within most central Protestant faiths. Among them, the annexation of large portions of the vocabulary and logic of everyday belief by the doctrines of the radical apocalyptic evangelicals was notable. In order to keep the variance of the public blossoming of the prophetic obsession in North American Protestantism in some kind of order for a time, we should stay with the central stem of that phenomenon, the base genealogy of the Niagara-on-the-Lake residential conferences. These had a direct influence on most forms of Protestant eschatology in the last 3 decades of the 19th century. For the historian, the Niagara Conference sequence also has a nice evidentiary value, for it was the articulation of the closest thing there was to a self-consciously canonical version of North American radical evangelical apocalypticism. This is particularly useful because, seemingly suddenly in the 1870s, the prophecy movement became fashionable, and there were so many variant forms that one can easily become disoriented. A meter stick is necessary. It is provided by the central line of development that, in its North American form, was framed by James Inglis in his Waymarks in the Wilderness and Scriptural Guide in the 1860s, by the sequence of private meetings of the Inglis coterie of scriptural adepts in the late 1860s and early 1870s, and, in the early to mid-1870s, by the activities of James Hall Brooks. These strands ultimately led to the Niagara phenomenon. So we return to Brooks. According to the Reverend Robert Cameron, who was both a friend and critic of Brooks, after the 1872 death of James Inglis, Dr. Brooks became the accepted leader of a large circle of pastors, evangelists, and Christian workers. True enough, but Brooks's succession was not quite that simple. Although, as C. Norman Krauss states, it was undeniable that from 1875 to his death in 1897, Brooks was undoubtedly the outstanding leader of the Bible Conference movement. The complication here is that Brooks needed to put himself in order before he could get others into line. Brooks's first problem was that his nasty fracas with the Northern Presbyterians, the Presbyterian Church USA, had to be put behind him if he were to have any purchase as a national leader, much less as an international figure, which he became in his Niagara Conference years. The situation went back to the early days of the Civil War, when he would not depart from neutrality on the support of the Union, or approve the opposition of the Presbyterian Church USA to slavery. As late as 1866, when he was permitted speaking privileges in the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church USA, he stood against the dominant view that we are required to believe slavery is evil and guilt and sin and the fruitful source of rebellion, bloodshed, and all manner of crimes. He would not. "Mr. Moderator," he declared, "I cannot and will not so believe. I care not for slavery, but I do care for the authority of the sacred Scriptures." And the Scriptures, he asserted, dictated the neutrality of the Church concerning political issues, of which slavery was one. By their series of strategic retreats, Brooks and his congregation were brought into good standing in the Northern Presbyterian denomination by 1874. From then on, he maintained a lifelong aloofness from Christian involvement in social movements and opposed interjections into the secular realm, save on those matters of morality that could not be considered political. For example, he adhered to the views he articulated in 1869 in a 144-page book that asked the question, "May Christians dance?" No points for guessing the answer to that. Brooks maintained, and in his later eschatology expanded his view, that the Church was not a kingdom of this world. It is reasonable to see Brooks, beginning in the mid-1860s, when he becomes aware of waymarks in the wilderness and subsequently joins the English coterie, as gradually articulating a doctrinal position that achieved the same thing as did his surrender in 1874 of his Civil War postures. It repositioned him so that he could operate freely in the northern states and central Ontario, the extended version of the Great Lakes Basin, without stigma. He remained formally Calvinist enough to keep in the good graces of the Northern Presbyterian Church, and he simultaneously entered into a northern stream of evangelicalism that was unreservedly non-political and that downplayed the amelioration of the secular human condition. In effect, he acquired a shield that protected him from potentially withering critiques of his behavior during the Civil War. Now, if we stopped there, that would leave both a too cold and too analytic a description of James Brooks's development from the mid-1860s to 1875, when he emerges as demonstrably the leader of the new Bible study and prophecy movement. Yes, Brooks was tactically shrewd, but one has to grant him the authenticity of his spiritual quest. In 1871, when English still was alive and a major direct influence on him, Brooks produced a series of outline sketches that led to his major lifetime work Maranatha, or The Lord Cometh, which appeared in late 1874. It is clear that by 1872, Brooks was working out a sanitized version of Brethrenism. He affirmed the distinctive core doctrines of the Brethren, but kept the source to himself. In January 1872, in the Prophetic Times, he took it for granted that his readers agreed that Jesus would return to earth and take the faithful heavenward. But there was a chilling question. "It is of unspeaking importance to the Christian," Brooks said, "to know whether he shall be exposed to the dreadful suffering and temptations that will mark the close of the present age, or whether he shall be removed to the heavenly heights and look down with undisturbed composure upon the tempest of judgment that will lay waste an ungodly world before the establishment of righteousness." Brooks made the implicit case for the pleasure of looking down from a great height upon the damned. Here he was affirming the Darbyite view, as against that of most open brethren, that the saints would be raptured up from the earth before the Great Tribulation, and that there would be a distinct period of time between the coming of Jesus for his saints and his appearing again to rule with them. Brooks also forwarded the view, common to both of the main schools of Brethrenism, that the faithful dead would be raised at the second coming, and that both they and the living saints would have been judged worthy of heaven, and thus would escape the Almighty's final judgment of humanity. Maranatha itself was a heavy lift, 545 pages, and functioned like what it resembled, a boundary balk. It was the first major work of apocalyptic evangelicalism that simultaneously was unmistakably dispensational and was undeniably American in tone and reference. It acquired authority within the evangelical community, and it made James Brooks the pivot in the management of prophetic studies on the North American continent. His founding The Truth, or Testimony for Christ, usually referred to simply as Truth or The Truth, the distinctive journal of the movement, and his being the primary force behind the Niagara-on-the-Lake conferences, are discussed in the following. The book itself is not a riveting read, in contrast to the other best-selling work of the 1870s, and well after, William E. Blackstone's galvanic megatract, Jesus is Coming. Brooks wrote as if he were talking at worshipers in the pews below his pulpit. He was not trying to attract the attention of non-evangelical passers-by. Each chapter was a well-wrought sermon of the hour-long variety, and taken together formed a comprehensive, unavoidably repetitive rhetorical carpet that at the middle brow level made the case for the secret rapture version of biblical prophecy. Brooks faced the paradigmatic solution to the problem of all American apocalyptic adepts, the problem being that, left to their own choice, most clergy and laity were not too concerned about millennial issues. The following concerning the noteworthy Presbyterian minister and seminary professor, the Reverend Dr. Robert Jefferson Breckinridge, is illustrative. Dr. Breckinridge had attended a synod where one of its ministers was on trial for heresy because he held premillennial views of the coming of Christ. When the doctor, himself an ardent premillennialist, was asked how opinions stood in regard to the subject, he answered, "There was a small party who believed Christ would come, another small party who believed he would not come, but an overwhelming majority did not care a fig whether he came or not." The answer for Brooks, and for most preachers on prophecy who looked to him as a mentor, was to write and preach in a form that talked about prophecy as an immediate and pressing matter that, for the moment, overshadowed all other issues of Christian theology and practice. He would get to those matters in his sermons later, or in tracts and books. Brooks made his case from the top down, and that is the key characteristic of the way that American dispensationalism usually was presented. Brooks's work is a useful diagnostic example of the difference between the eventually dominant American version and the Brethren original. Brooks in Maranatha focused on the turrets, parapets, and crenellations of the end-time architecture, and backfilled basic theology and hermeneutics only when necessary, and then only minimally. He built from the roof downward. That is the opposite to the way the Brethren had created their system. They had begun in the 1820s and 1830s with the foundation, ecclesiology, and their eschatology was dependent upon several interconnected courses of posts and beams. These consisted of their innovative mode of biblical interpretation, mixing extreme literalism and equally extreme typological tropes, all of which were wrapped in a near antinomian doctrine of grace and of a weekly liturgical embrace of mystical Holy Communion. While it is impossible to appreciate the ideational components of American radical apocalyptic evangelicalism without recognizing most of the parts as being primarily derivative from transatlantic Brethrenism, the New World advocates did take shortcuts and did leave out some of the structural components the Brethren had employed. Note the way Brooks opens Chapter 1. All Christians believe that the Savior will return at some period, however remote, to our earth. Aside from being manifestly untrue, all Christians? Certainly not. This assertion opened the way to a bold shortcut. It is also a cherished expectation to his followers of every name and in every age and every land that although unknown or rejected by far the larger portion of our race at present, the nations will eventually be led to crown him Lord of all. This happy age, when his name shall be everywhere known and his authority shall be gladly recognized, is usually called the millennium. In 2 stunning paragraphs, Brooks, writing with a flat reasonableness as if he were referring to an item in the evening newspaper, declares universal among Christians a belief, Jesus reigning literally on earth for 1,000 years, that until the early 19th century most Christians had never heard of, and which most, even in Brooks's own time, would have been taken as daft. The millennium as allegory was well known, but since Augustine, most Christians had taken it as non-literal, if they paid much heed at all. And then, in just one more paragraph, Brooks holds up the scorecard by which his book will be judged. Those who believe, now he seems to admit there may be some Christians who are exceptions to his earlier normative assertions, are all in agreement that there is no dispute concerning the fact of his coming at some time, nor concerning the fact of a millennium. So, the only issue is, are they premillennialists or postmillennialists? And who is right? We have seen arguments structured this way before, set up a false dichotomy that excludes everything except 2 alternatives, and one of the 2 is declared to be incorrect, and thus the other is adjudged to be ultimate truth. Not compelling, but Brooks did it so well, covering his brass neck with a sober clerical collar, that one has to be impressed. Maranatha became the required text for a generation of evangelical clergy and lay leaders, those who attended the Niagara conferences, and still others who took their cues from Brooks's The Truth, the news sheet he founded in early 1875 that soon turned into a monthly journal. He continued to edit it until his death in 1897. It was self-consciously a continuation of James Inglis's Waymarks in the Wilderness, just as Maranatha itself was based on a publicly declared intention to continue the work of Inglis and Charles Campbell. Brooks's periodical, Truth, was markedly different from Inglis's serial productions in that his appeared with dependable regularity. Also, it had a considerable circulation. Sales of the annual binding of the year's issues were said to be 42,000 in 1886. Unlike a general interest literary or news periodical, one subscribed to Truth as a form of allegiance and passed it around to fellow believers. To return directly to Maranatha, my view is that we should see this generative volume as permitting us to begin a change in our vocabulary from proto-dispensationalism that recognizes the evangelical shift towards full public embrace of much, not all, of the brethren-derived system of dispensations that moves onward to the variant that we can recognize as the central versions of the various American dispensationalisms. Granted, dispensationalism as a term was not a recognized usage until the 1920s, but it refers to a real phenomenon that emerged earlier. In Maranatha, we have a radical discussion whose success in large part was a matter of tone. With only a few exceptions, Brooke kept his voice down, even though he was dealing with the end times. He adopted a form of semi-scholarship that implied great learning. In fact, Brooks was an autodidact. He had no advanced training in ancient or modern languages, but he used linguistic dictionaries and grammars to good effect. He could go on about the 32 Greek verbs that are rendered as come in the authorized version, and the 4 sources of the noun coming, as for example he did in his chapter Christ's Coming Literal. This was not medicine show scholarship for the rubes. Brooks's intent was serious, but undeniably it played in Peoria. Thus, his son-in-law and biographer David Williams could claim that There have been certain deluded men who have ignorantly implied that Dr. Brooks knew little but the English Bible. That, Williams said, was palpably untrue, and it would not be charitable, though doubtless true, to say that he could have taught them Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. But it is only a simple fact to state that he was an expert scholar in ancient languages. Actually, Brooks was a strong student of the English language Bible, and not much more. In his world, that was quite enough. His tone was notably steady, even courteous, when he went after the work of the Reverend Dr. David Brown, the most convincing of the post-millennialists within Brooks's own Presbyterian tradition. Moreover, he had a technique that fit well with his dictionary discussion of Greek vocabulary. He possessed a sizable collection of books, papers, and notes on lectures containing the arguments of some of the best-known theologues of all eras, relying, understandably, mostly on Protestant divines. References and quotations were worked quite smoothly into his argument, sometimes to point out disagreements, but in civil terms. At other times, a sentence or two from major figures seemed to put them on his side. Again, an air of great learning was intended, none of which was undercut by his willingness to infill some chapters with pages of what are essentially notes for Bible readings. Isaiah particularly, and multiple illustrations of Brooks's statement that one verse in 30 of the New Testament, let it be remembered, points with eager gesture to his promised and expected return as the radiant object of Christian hope. Given that James Brooks was writing for an audience of middle-class North American Protestants, men and women in churches with polished pews and raised pulpits, sympathetic to evangelicalism, if not necessarily evangelicals themselves, he has to be judged highly successful. He limited primary attention to the end times, and he discounted postmillennialism in a convincing and gentlemanly manner. So, the return of Jesus to earth before the millennium, an assumed reality that is silently embraced as a proven truth, was the only option left on the board. Impressive, but Brooks was even better than that. He employed, as well as it ever was done, a mode of argument by insinuation that was to become prominent among American evangelical apocalypticists, and that still befuddles some historians. He was explaining the origin and nature of a subset by referring to the origin and character of the larger set of which it was a part. Crudely, similar to explaining the origin, evolution, and defining characteristics of humans from general data on mammals, and finding that fully satisfactory to define humanity. Brooks talked generic premillennialism, but he actually was delivering a pitch for its distinct, difficult, and demanding subset, dispensationalism. To be sure, it was an American form, not quite the full system defined by the Brethren, but derived from them it certainly was. C. Norman Krauss noted that Darbyite dispensationalism assumes a premillennial eschatology, and there are many areas in which they overlap. He added, the terminology of the Plymouth Brethren was often accepted when there was no clear understanding of all the implications. Brooks rang the distinctly Brethren notes on eschatology, beliefs that as part of a complete doctrinal system had not been held anywhere until the 1830s, and then only in Plymouth Brethrenism. The entire Christian era as a parenthesis in divine history, one that comes to an end in the secret rapture, the figure of Jesus to be literally physically present in both the rapture and the later appearing, the former for his saints, the latter with them. There would be a first resurrection of the dead, in this case only for deceased true believers at the time of the secret rapture, and a second resurrection would occur after the millennium, and overwhelmingly it would be the raising of the unrighteous for final judgment, and the probably 7 years between the rapture and the appearing would be a time of great and hideous tribulation on earth. The raptured saints, however, would not be there. James Brooks did not pick these things up solely while talking shop with other eschatological enthusiasts. They are just too distinctive, too indicative of a close reading of Brethren literature, and perhaps of deep discussion with some of the saints. To make that judgment clearer, there are some finer points, so tightly unique to the Brethren system that Brooks is passing them along, even as sidebars to his main argument, indicates that he had assimilated, not just noticed or casually endorsed, the main frame of Brethren hermeneutics and doctrine, not all the details, but much more than he or his followers ever wanted to admit publicly. One of the probative indicators of this point is Brooks's replicating a weird, rarely noted, Darbyitoporia concerning the nature of Jesus' rule during the millennium. Darby talked a lot about Jesus and his saints returning at the appearing as the conclusion of the Great Tribulation, but he was ambiguous about how the saints were to join Jesus in his rule over the earth. Just there, Darby went blurry. There was within Christian tradition a range of interpretations of what the saints would be doing during the millennium, ranging from the imaginative, carnal details that St. Augustine so disliked, basically that they would have a very rich and vulgar earthly life, to their being transcendent spirits of no fixed address. Darby's peculiar problem was that once he had embraced the faithful remnant of Israel as being the spearhead of the full Jewish millennial recovery of control of the land of Israel, he risked having the Jews being partially displaced by the Gentile saints who would conjoin him in the rule of earth. So, what Darby never makes clear is what it means when he interprets Revelation as saying that Jesus will be joined by his saints, overwhelmingly Gentiles, in ruling over the earth. Really? Would the saints, returning from their 7 years in heaven, actually touch the earth and directly help to run things, or would their rule be semi-celestial, as embodied spirits orbiting the earth like celestial management consultants? That is a profane way of expressing what hungry laity and earnest pastors well might like to know. As early as 1840, in a long series of lectures on the hopes of the Church of God, Darby had detailed what biblical prophecy revealed about the destiny of the Jews and the Gentile nations. He possessed the wisdom to leave the arrangements for governing the millennium blank. Dear friends, you will understand that there is an infinity of details into which I have not entered. For myself, I attach more importance to the larger features of prophecy. However this may be, there is nothing to hinder your study of prophecy, even in its minute details. Brooks's concluding chapter in Maranatha, an unspoken homage to Darby's lectures, was entitled The Hope of the Church, and it too avoided pronouncing on governing arrangements of human society after the reappearing of Jesus. Brooks has the saints actually coming to earth to effect the overthrow of the Antichrist and his allies. But for details, all we get is that the appearing of Jesus with the saints is to be amid scenes of visible glory and accompaniments of peerless magnificence. Whatever the doctrinal virtues of the shared postures of Darby and of Brooks, the identity has use as historical evidence. If one sees two individuals sequentially avoiding the same hidden tripwire, it is likely that one of them is imitating the other. When Brooks was forced to turn to doctrinal concepts that are the structural support timbers for the apocalyptic narrative that he had embraced, he employed the minimum of necessary references. In the case of the Brethren segregating the Scriptures into two parts, rightly dividing the word, as the slogan became, he noted that there were two classes of texts, those that predicted the restoration of the Jews, and those that applied to the rapture of Christian believers. He did not, however, explain what that meant as far as reading the entire corpus of the Scriptures or how the two covenants were related. Wisely, he kept away from the exclusive brethren's abandonment of the classic Protestant view that the first and second covenants were contiguous. He thus did not have to endorse the Darbyite view of the total replacement of law by grace. Although Maranatha is a work of biblical interpretation, it has an unstated practical agenda: to put together a platoon of leaders within the several Protestant denominations who would accept the secret rapture variant of end times eschatology. Here Brooks was artful. His restrained tone was well designed. He was frequently generous in quoting and endorsing gobbets from a wide range of divines from several denominations. Granted, his index card mode of stringing together quotations often required that he take phrases out of their context, but a serious minister or informed layman was not apt to slam the book shut because of wounded sensibilities. Implicitly, Brooks was making the case for rejecting the foundational brethren cry, "Come ye apart," and laying the groundwork for its replacement with a pan-Protestant network. This united front idea can be termed ecumenical, as long as one is aware of the several contrasting usages of the term over the past century and a half. Crucially, Brooks was not implying the need for separation from existing denominations, but something of an alliance among fellow believers within the various faiths. The "this world" demonstration of the distance thus opened between the original brethren, most especially the exclusives, and their American eschatological descendants is found in two organizational instances. The first occurred in England, where in 1846 the Evangelical Alliance was formed. It was largely a reaction to the Tractarian movement within the Church of England. It drew together leaders from among the established church, the dissenting bodies, some from the European Reformed tradition, and some American clergy, on the basis of a shared, essentially evangelical doctrinal statement. The reaction by Darby and the exclusives was definitive. No cooperation, no shared doctrinal statement, no, no, no. Secondly, in contrast, James Brooks himself in 1875 and 1876 was the chief driver for the creation of a pan-evangelical set of annual North American prophecy meetings. These produced a shared statement of faith, but the designers were careful not to hint at the creation of a separate denomination. In Maranatha, when citing scores and scores of authorities by name, Brooks frequently provided their denominational affiliation: Baptist, Presbyterian, Anglican, Methodist, and so on. Except in one case, the group in North America who most often were called Plymouth Brethren. That is no surprise, but it is impressive how general the suppression of reference became among the keenest proponents of secret rapture apocalypticism. This self-censorship continued well into the 1890s, and thus it is hardly surprising that ordinary worshippers could affirm the American forms of dispensationalism without having any idea of where its central ideas came from. The unspoken prohibition on mentioning the brethren, unless it was absolutely necessary, was slightly more complex than it appears on the surface. Brooks, unlike many of his eschatologically keen colleagues, was willing to admit his admiration for the writings of some of the brethren, but he did so with such a soft voice that it was nearly inaudible. Thus, in Maranatha, he appreciatively referred to the work of Samuel Prideaux Tregelles, everywhere recognized as one of the most eminent of all our biblical scholars and critics. Brooks quoted Tregelles's translations of the Scriptures various times, but at no point mentioned his sometime affiliation, much less that he had been one of the open brethren who stood by B.W. Newton in the Brethren Schism. Nor, when Brooks admiringly filled most of a page with a quotation from the commentary on Leviticus by Charles Henry Mackintosh, CHM, was the author's exclusive Brethrenism mentioned. In the wider community of evangelical clergy, there was operationally an equivalent of the parliamentary three-line whip. Try strenuously not to mention the brethren. If one mentioned admirable work by individual saints, avoid attaching their affiliation. And if one has to say anything positive about the brethren as a group, surround it with the porcupine quills of multiple reservations. The most fascinating and unexpectedly positive reference to brethren material in Maranatha relates to one of the central passages in the canon of end times texts, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 verses 14 to 18, invoking the trump of God, the voice of the archangel, the first resurrection of the dead, and in total, the events that later came to be labeled the Rapture. The Bible does not use the term. Brooks cites the King James Version and the revision of the New Testament by the Reverend Henry Alford, Dean of Canterbury, and then gives the full text from Darby's translation. No affiliation or explanation, but Darby's version is taken as being one of the best windows on a crucial Greek passage. Why would James Brooks refer even briefly to a work by John Nelson Darby? One can only speculate. One alternative is that this single tiny reference might function like Brooks's reference to Charles Mackintosh, a tip of a wink to brethren that some regular denominational clergy were open-minded in their thinking and might be worth listening to. Or, this is merely a guess based on Brooks's late life reflections, that actually Brooks had a soft spot for Darby. Muted but genuine. Undeniably, Brooks was a professional, in both the sense of being a devoted ordained cleric and in his being very good at protecting the form and practice of his calling. A real pro. Yet he had a private, more emotional side. Perhaps it was only old age, but Brooks in 1894 generously published in Truth a letter by the late J.N. Darby, wherein Darby, having been praised in the preface of a book written by one of the brethren, responded with a modesty that Brooks found admirable. A year later, Brooks printed a fictional account of a young preacher who had often heard with great pleasure and profit Mr. Darby. It seems that in these later years, Brooks distinguished almost nostalgically between Darby and his confreres in the first generation of brethren and those who came later. The old originals were to be admired. In May 1895, Brooks reviewed in an editorial 2 pamphlets from contemporary present-day brethren who, in his words, were from those known as brethren who are writing against brethren. He meant other brethren, and he contrasted their in-house vitriol with the situation more than 60 years ago, when a movement was started, which promised to be of incalculable service to multitudes. The leading spirits were J.N. Darby and B.W. Newton, both men of decided ability, extensive learning, profound acquaintance with the Word of God, and ample means to publish and disseminate their views. Today, in the 1890s, there were 24 brethren fragments. He exaggerated, but listed clearly the main parties, most of whom had emerged after Darby's death in 1882. In a related editorial, Brooks seemed for a moment almost to venerate Darby. The brethren have been largely engaged in kicking each other, in trying to get earnest Christians out of systems, in forbidding their people to listen to preachers who preach the truth in different denominations, in rejecting fellowship with other believers, in lofty and ridiculous claims to be the church. But Mr. Darby, to whom thousands are so greatly indebted, once said, "I would not be surprised if they exclude me after a while." And then the noble old man added, The comfort I have is that no man can call me a Darbyite. Noble old man. That appellation Brooks would now grant, but Darby greatly missed it in failing to recognize the permanent offices of pastor and elder or deacon, because, as he said, there is no apostle to ordain them. This, for so strong a man, was extremely foolish. He might as well have said there can be no church, because there is no apostle to organize it. Brooks still was a professional clergyman. A different but related matter is whether John Nelson Darby and James Hall Brooks ever had actually met in person. I would be surprised, but not disappointed if they had not, but then I have no investment in the outcome of what turns out still to be a matter of some residual bitterness. During his lifetime, some of those who loathed Darby looked at any personal encounter with him as courting the risk of something akin to Old Testament corpse contagion. Down the years, to protect Brooks's reputation, they and their doctrinal descendants have denied any evidence of such a meeting ever having taken place, and they could be right. On the other hand, appreciators of Darby have been quite willing to see Brooks and Darby momentarily clasping hands. The pivotal issue has been the historical accuracy of two statements published in 1942 by Harry Ironside. One of these, concerning the brethren, was that Dr. Brooks knew and loved many of them. His pulpit had often been opened to them. J. N. Darby, Malachi Taylor, Paul J. Loiseau, and others had preached in his church at various times. The other was Dr. James H. Brooks, in whose church Mr. Darby held 2 weeks' meetings while in St. Louis in the 70s, considered him one of the greatest Bible scholars of his generation. Dr. Harry Ironside, 1876 to 1951, is an interesting source. Born in Toronto, reared in California, Ironside, during the course of his spiritual life, passed through the Salvation Army and also through at least 2 schools of Bretheranism before becoming a non-denominational Dispensationalist evangelical. He was one of the few persons with roots in Bretheranism ever to be widely thought of as lovable. That latter characteristic may explain why he was ex-Brethren, and in part why in 1930 he was tapped to become the pastor of the Moody Church in Chicago. This was the flagship congregation of non-denominational evangelicalism east of the Rocky Mountains, and he held the post into 1948 with immense success. Ironside possessed the ecclesiastical equivalent of sharp oral folk memory, a mind respectful and generous and capacious. He had a cache of inside information on brethren and their opponents that ran well back into the last quarter of the 19th century. His history of Bretheranism was not footnoted history, but frequently one finds that some item he had archived in the back of his memory had been confirmed as later documentation has become available. When he asserts something, one listens, but not uncritically. Thus far, no confirmation of Brooks and Darby meeting, and crucially of Brooks's providing Darby with the use of the Walnut Street Presbyterian Church in St. Louis, has turned up, but it well may. The most likely time periods are 1872 and to a lesser degree 1875, when Darby spent significant time in St. Louis. In June or July 1872, Darby wrote from St. Louis that, "I have had good opportunities here, and I am in pretty full intercourse with those exercised, among whom are more than one official minister." Possibly Brooks. Notice what we have yet to mention, except in passing: the flag on the mast, the schema of the divine dispensations of time. And that indeed should be the last major feature to take our attention, for the dispensations are among the least load-bearing of the main components of the system that came to be generally referred to as dispensationalism. Do not bolt. As far as the formal architecture of the dispensations is concerned, we should look first at the Darbyite original, and only secondly at 19th century American forms of dispensationalism. And we should not be intimidated by the label, dispensationalism, that was put on the package in the 20th century. Certainly, the concept of dispensations and the adjective dispensational were increasingly enculturated in North America in the last quarter of the 19th century by radical evangelical apocalypticists, but not limited to them. And not all eschatological exegetes were keen on the dispensations. Those qualifications being accepted, there was indeed something distinctive that became widespread among several Protestant denominations in North America. The form that James Brooks and the Niagara Prophetic Conferences represented was the main line, the one that ran back through James Inglis and Waymarks in the Wilderness to the Brethren writers of the United Kingdom and ultimately to the founders of Brethrenism, the saints of County Wicklow and South County Dublin, wealthy Anglo-Irish landlords, affrighted at the rise of the Roman Catholics, searching the Scriptures, and continually praying that in some miraculous way the Almighty would put time back on their side. John Nelson Darby is the baseline. Here, the simple fact is that pace almost every historian of post-Civil War American evangelicalism who mentions John Nelson Darby, he did not in fact care much for the formal schema of successive dispensations, and certainly did not materialize one for his followers. Right. That statement can be easily disproved by turning up a clear schematic diagram done by Darby, or even an unambiguous list by Darby of the usual 7 or 8 dispensations in sequence. Here one is willing to stand corrected. Note, though, that Darby frequently stated his rejection of systems, and that each of the diagrams of the successive dispensations that became popular in the late 19th century was such a system. Not that Darby did not talk about dispensations. He did, frequently, and he was deeply invested in his own creation, the parenthesis that ran from Pentecost to the Second Coming. All other dispensations in his thinking were secondary contributory mechanisms to the final glorious denouement, direct divine rule. It is feasible to interrogate Darby's dense prose, and to find hidden in the foliage enough material to allow one to say, this is what Darby meant, but that is heuristic at best. One cannot produce a clear schema, not even a simple box diagram, without being unfaithful to the context of his specific comments, and he left so many matters undefined, and still others contradictory. Actually, listing any of the possible variant schema that one might ascribe to Darby misses the awkward fact that this was not the way Darby thought about dispensations. Not only did he repudiate systems as such, he focused on the singular motive force by which the Almighty drove history forward, and it was the same from one dispensation to the next: failure. The details of the various dispensations had varying degrees of fascination for him, but they were merely bent and discardable pieces of sheet metal on the roadside to eternity. What counted was the infinite force that left them there. Each dispensation began with God giving humankind a chance, a fresh start with clear rules, and humanity failed. Then, but only then, the Almighty granted another chance, another dispensation. John Nelson Darby loved failure. He railed against humanity's almost infinite imperfection, and yet he knew that it was the trigger that at some unpredictable point, any moment, in the present dispensation, would send Jesus back to earth, and finally there would be a dispensation worth living in, eternally. The problem, as far as assimilating the focus on failure of Darby and the early brethren into North American evangelical religion, is that it required an acceptance of his view that the secret rapture and all the glories to follow it were to be preceded by all the Christian churches being in unrepairable ruin, minus, of course, his one visible church of God on earth. That was a very hard sell, and by the mid-1880s, dispensationalism had become a distinct modification tailored to fit the New World. Thus, while Darby and his colleagues in the first generation of Brethren focused on divine force and saw dispensational structures as expressive embodiments of the ultimate force majeure, American dispensationalists in the main case settled on structure, on the stack of successive dispensations, and avoided the full issue of divine force. For in echt Brethrenism, it promised the condemnation of their own churches. What held for Darby was also true of his fellow saints in the first 2 decades. They did not produce schemata and diagrams of various sorts. The main exception was W. Craig Baines, whom we discussed in earlier chapters. Baines first put out a scheme in England in the 1850s and expanded it in the 1860s. The version published in Waymarks in the Wilderness directly influenced James H. Brooks, and thence, some argue, through Brooks's mentorship, rolled onward to Cyrus Scofield. Baines and other Brethren writers, Trotter, Stanley, and McIntosh, for example, were consequential for North American evangelicalism, but each of them, when using the term dispensations, employed it as descriptive rather than causal. They took for granted the original Brethren doctrine that the passage of time, as inhulled in the successive dispensations, had no force of its own. The failure to meet divine expectations, was what moved time forward. In most aspects of the new American apocalypticism, James Hall Brooks in Maranatha in late 1874 was an opinion-determining leader. But on the schematics of the dispensations, he was transitional, being closer to the old country roots of dispensational thought than one might expect. He was surprisingly offhand about the dispensations and gave them less than 4 full pages of attention. For the sake of convenience, he suggested, let us divide the dispensations of Jehovah's dealings with man according to the view of Professor Bain of McGill University. He was referring, of course, to W.C. Baines, who was not a professor, but was the chief operating officer of the royally chartered institution in Montreal, then known as the University of McGill College. As mentioned earlier, Baines, one of the leading exclusive brethren of central Canada, had published an extensive work on the dispensations in 1864 to 1865 in Waymarks in the Wilderness, edited by James Inglis, who, whatever his editorial virtues, was not very good at the consistent spelling of personal names. The schema of dispensations, put forward by Baines and adopted by Brooks, is found in Chapter 14 and is not analyzed here. That is acceptable, because the real point about Brooks's discussion of the several dispensations in Maranatha is that he skitters away from seriously engaging the implications of the dispensations. He knows that the unavoidable implication of the Brethren sequence is that the phrase church in ruins comes thumping through. So instead of engaging the logic of the Brethren doctrine by either accepting it or knocking it down, he quickly changes the topic. The disjuncture is so obvious that one could legitimately wonder if several frames of type have been accidentally thrown out. He immediately points out that many prophecies that are commonly taken as referring to the Christian church actually refer to Israel and Jerusalem, which is a non sequitur that has nothing to do with the issue at hand. And secondly, that there is no prophecy that supports the post-millennialist view of the conversion of the world, which has even less relevance at this point. And then he is off to 9 pages on Isaiah that are yet farther afield. Clearly, the full dispensational sequence is something he does not want to deal with. That is why one takes Brooks in this era, the early 1870s, to be a transitional figure in this one aspect of radical apocalyptic evangelicalism. A decade and a half later, prophetic conferences would obsessively delineate each dispensation, often completing their discussions with diagrams. The trick, if these efforts were to be successful pan-denominationally, was to blur, ignore, or define away the corrosive brethren assertion that in the final dispensation before the rapture, all the formal denominations were in ruins, corrupt, and unredeemable. In Chapter 9, we suggested the metaphor of the wasp waste passage to describe the way that the available forms of eschatology, only some of them being apocalyptic, were fined down during the 1860s, almost exactly the same time that the secular reconfiguration of both the U.S. and the Canadian civil polities occurred. The chief result of the religious process was a form of end-times doctrine that was fresh to most New World theology and that found a strong purchase in evangelical Protestantism, radical apocalyptic evangelicalism, based on the literal physical return of Jesus, the rapture of his saints, and the millennium of Jesus' rule on earth. As contained in a single coherent doctrinal constellation, these doctrines had their origin in the drawing rooms of the Anglo-Irish landowning class, who had adopted the label of brethren. The passage of these doctrines to the New World was facilitated both by the physical travel of brethren missionaries to the New World and by the spreading of many of the main ideas in a flood of printed forms. Of course, there are examples of North American forms of apocalyptic eschatology that have been labeled indigenous, meaning that they were created in the settler cultures of North America, without much input from abroad. Millerism is the chief exhibit, among several others. None of these formed a system that came close to rivaling the Brethren's in coherence and thus in force. The key point about the wasp waste metaphor is that it involves not only the passage through a constrictive corridor, but the subsequent flourishing of a wide range of derivative eschatologies once the transit of the narrow passage was done. In this context, James Hall Brooks is well worth our attention. He is a clear and demonstrable link in a chain that starts with the early residential prophetic house parties at the Powers Court estate in County Wicklow in the early 1830s and runs onward to the defining schismatic delineation of the exclusive and the open brethren in the late 1840s, then to the writings and missionary work of the transatlantic saints as they operated first in Canada and soon more fully around the entire Great Lakes Basin, and finally to most of the northern states by the end of the Civil War in the United States and Confederation in Canada. Through James Inglis and Charles Campbell and Waymarks in the Wilderness and the private meetings of 1868 to 1872, the multiple possible forms of North American apocalyptic evangelicalism were reduced to those compatible with the main lines of imported Brethrenism, either open and or exclusive in origin. In these invitational conferences, James Brooks shone and acquired a valuable and viable northern U.S. identity. Brooks's Maranatha is the formative text for the mainstream of the North American prophetic movement as it emerged from the mid-1870s until the mid-1890s. Maranatha is underappreciated historically, mostly because it is not much joy to read. It lacks the electricity of come-to-Jesus writing intended to scare the doubter into faith, and it does not have the diverting confrontational vigor of the fights that broke out in the 1890s about issues such as how long the Great Tribulation will last, and would believers really escape that terrible time. Granted, Brooks had his intriguing idiosyncrasies, but even these were muted in his determination to build a pan-Protestant form of apocalypticism, one that would not undermine existing denominations, but be embraced, at least in part, by most of them.